Okay, so Ronnie, we're getting close to I don't know, I've lost count of our episodes, but we're getting closer and closer to, like the 100 episode mark. And what you didn't know is that I had a special episode in mind that I intended to be your soccer conversion episode. And so that's actually what today's all about.
Many have tried before. I took a test online once to see who should be my team.
Okay,
I feel like it was Tottenham.
that's a good choice. That's a
It's
better
a good choice.
choice than many other choices, right, Brady?
There's worse choices. Yeah.
If you're watching this episode, if you're not watching this episode, if you're just listening to this episode, you can't see that our guest today, Brady Josephson's got on a lovely Liverpool jacket, and yeah, he's got his silly little Anfield sign in the back, and I think as much as Brady and I have ever talked about any version of nonprofit marketing, we probably traded jabs about Tottenham and Liverpool more.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I mean, it's a little bit more fun sometimes to take things outside of our professional world and talk about our hobbies and interests.
our hobbies and interests. So today, just by hanging around us, Ronnie, I think that's we're not going to have to try very hard. It's going to just seep in, and you're going to find yourself awake at 6:30 tomorrow morning at a pub and watching a game.
It's just like osmosis of being near
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
that's it.
That's right.
That's it. So welcome to Group Thinkers and the podcast from RKD Group. Uh, very delighted to have our guest on today, Brady Josephson. Brady, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Delighted is the way that I'll put it, is because Brady, you've sat in our shoes previously. You have been a podcast host, you've been a podcast guest, you've been a speaker, you have worn a lot of hats, and so I appreciate that about you, and I hope to get you to put on a couple different hats today as a part of our conversation. But just at the outset, man, you're currently a little more than a year in at Charity Water, serving as the lead for their marketing and growth team. And so, one, I want you to unpack what the heck that means, and then two, I want you to tell us how did you end up there?
Yeah, great. And I think I'll start with the first one and then kind of work back because it all hopefully makes sense. But leading marketing and growth at Charity Water is, a bit of a dream job. I started out in international developments in right around the time where Charity Water came to be. It started in 2006. So for the most of my career, Charity Water's been there. And if you're in international development and marketing and fundraising with a focus on digital, you know a lot about Charity Water. And so my journey to Charity Water meandered through technology. I worked for a software company for a bit, worked for a tech-enabled donor advised fund in Canada. So really got to know the philanthropic space, not just the fundraising space, which is really interesting. Did some consulting and research, as you know, at Next After, and really got a good picture of what was going on at a high level view across the industry in the US, and even did some research in 9 different countries around the world. And so a real kind of broad based application of knowledge of what's going on in digital. I worked in international development, startup nonprofit in Zambia, and then a microfinance organization working for the Canadian arm. So kind of that is really where my heart and passion is and has always been. And some startups. I had my own agency. I helped start an agency with a technology company, and that technology company had a startup that ended up getting kind of merged into one. And so, Charity Water is a bit of a blend of a lot of those things. It is an international development nonprofit, but it's very tech centric. It doesn't think and act a lot like a traditional nonprofit, which is partly why I wanted to work there and partly why I think it's really, really interesting. And it's I think a blend of a lot of my knowledge and experience kind of combining to hopefully let me do a good job for the organization. So that's kind of my career in a nutshell and maybe how it applies to Charity Water.
You you start off by saying it's a bit of a dream job, and so there's the we all had those experiences from, like, let's say, I'm gonna say 2008 to 2010 up until 2015, where you would sit with a client, you'd be talking about a strategy, and somehow they would say something like, "Well, we just want to do what Charity Water's doing."
Yeah.
And at one point, we actually had our equivalent of a swear jar that if Charity Water was referenced, you had to put money in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so talk to me about your perception on the outside versus coming in. What are some things that you didn't know or didn't anticipate that you thought would be the case and were spot on? Like, give us a little peek inside the walls there.
Yeah, I mean, the organization is very different today than it was back then, right? It's a $100 million nonprofit that's been around for over 15 years, and so it's a pretty different stage in its development than kind of early on. And so I think a lot of my perception, and maybe your perception of Charity Waters, from maybe a different era. So there's some of
Yeah,
that of just
yeah.
organizational life stage. But one of the things that was surprising, even though I thought it was going to be this way, is the level of competency and creativity. You see things and you hear things, and you're like, wow, there must be some really sharp, amazing people. And then you get in, you're like, oh my gosh, these people are even smarter, better, more creative than I'd even imagined. The talent level is pretty crazy. Um, so you're kind of expecting that, and that was surprising. The thing that you also maybe knew that has blown me away is the level of care and empathy that the organization has internally for its people, but externally, the core fabric of the organization has such a love and connection and devotion to caring for donors. And it's a bit cliche, and we all say, oh, let's care about donors, but probably more so than any organization I've ever seen and been around. It is like legit passion, care. This is what we do. Doesn't matter what your wealth score is. It doesn't matter what your predicted LTV is. There's things that we do because it's right and because we believe it's part of our mission and vision. That was kind of mind blowing, to see that played out. And then the thing that was maybe surprising on the other side is maybe a lack of some data use or some more traditional performance marketing sophistication type things, because it's such a big program that is so effective. You maybe assume they're doing a lot of those things, and maybe at a time, but at least when I came in, I was surprising at how they weren't doing some of those things. And so it's an opportunity, but it's also interesting, like, if you do the big things right, great brand, great care, great people. Some of the smaller things, like, oh, a little gift array suggestion on a donation page that doesn't get a lot of, like, it's not going to move the needle for you.
Yeah,
So it was a
yeah,
real interesting reset for me of, like, the main things, the main things, the main thing. And I think Charity
yeah,
Water has done that so well that it covers over a multitude of little things that maybe aren't perfect.
yeah. That's man, that's so interesting and so well said, because that sometimes results can lend to cutting corners. Like, that's not a nonprofit marketing indictment. That's life. I
Right.
mean, there are times to where if your team's winning and you're on a roll, then it might be really hard to be, going hard at training, right? It's like those sort of little
Yeah.
nuances that still play into the space that we work now. So one of the things that caught mine and Ronnie's attention recently was your 2019. I think it might have been like a closing keynote, essentially, at Neo. I think it was 2019, and you were kind of challenging, rethinking what philanthropy and generosity in particular look like. And I know for years a part of your pursuit has been redefining generosity and those pieces. And so I understand that you even referenced some of our research in your time on stage last week at Neo. Can you share with us a little bit about what from our Listen Up research piqued your interest?
Yeah, I think anytime there's a good piece of research done well, and there's a lot of research that's not done well, So partnering with Josh McQueen is obviously a good step to do good research.
Yeah.
I think it's imperative that we do read it and listen and check it out. And more of my pursuit is on the qualitative side more than anything. I think the more that you work with quantitative or data, you love it. It's great. There's a lot of opportunity, and then you kind of quickly realize, oh, there's a lot of limits and flaws to this. Or if you just take doing what data says to the end, it leads you to not a great place.
Right.
So pursuing more of the qualitative research has been something that's been more on my plate in the last couple of years, and this year research would be in there as well. If layering in the commitment level or the engagement or the self-described connection level from low, medium, high was a
Yeah.
really cool way to think about it, because I think people like Adrian Sargent and whoever, there's a lot of research around commitment levels and loyalty levels and how imperative it is, but we as a sector have done very little about it. And so to see that show up in some research and try to provide some more insight into the differences even between high commitment and low commitment, or really engaged and low engaged, is really interesting, and something that we as a sector and me as a professional and probably us as an org need to make some steps and some progress to really say, oh, it's one cool thing to read research and talk about it, but we're getting to the point where it's not that difficult to implement some of those things, and we really need to do that.
So thinking about that, Brady, just exactly what you were mentioning there, I'll just kind of throw it out there. How do we do better? How do we build stronger relationships with donors and make them feel more connected to nonprofits? Just big open question. How do we do it?
It's I don't know if I have the answer.
Right.
I think I'm a big culture person, the expression culture eats strategy for breakfast kind of thing, for sure. And I think culturally in our pursuit of data has come at the expense of listening to donors or really understanding donors to a degree. And data helps you understand donor behavior to a degree, but knowing what people say and what they want is huge. So the use of survey data intentionally with some sophistication, it's not just, oh yeah, we got a survey. Like, what are you asking? Why? What are you going to do with it? Just because you have a Survey Monkey login doesn't mean you know how to do a survey. And me as well, I don't know how to do surveys. I'm not an expert in surveys. We hired other people. We have a lot to learn. But I think that's the starting point, because the other thing too is it takes a long time to accumulate enough zero-party data or data that donors willingly give to you directly for it to be worth taking action on, right? Just saying, oh, we have 50 survey responses, let's do this. That's risky. You need to accumulate that data over a series of time. And then for us, we need to then model it to say, this person said this, here's what their behavior looks like. Now this insight is trustworthy or not. So the long answer short, we have to start today, because it takes a while. If you're not collecting that information, if you're not exploring modeling off commitment levels, you're never going to end up at the right place. And it is not something where you can just, oh, we rented a list and we send the email out. Fine. This is a very different bucket of strategy. That is a long tail, long-term type of thing. And if you haven't started, you're just one day away from being able to actionalize that. So that's the biggest thing, is you have to understand the limits of data. And if you didn't understand that before, the last year or so has just been a big old slap in the face with the limits of data and data modeling, and especially the paid social side. So the time is here. It was here a while ago, but it's definitely here. And you have to start thinking about your zero-party data, your survey data, and modeling things off of who people are, as opposed to just what they do.
Yeah, that's I think the thing that I've observed from recent years is that there has been two camps, right? There's been a camp that will come in with anecdotal evidence. So not qualitative, anecdotal evidence of we heard from someone, or we've heard from our donors this. And then you start to press on it, especially if you're trying to defend a strategy of, okay, how many people said that to you? Under what context did they say that they, are getting too many emails, or that, you're mailing them too much, or, sure, one person one time sent in a cinder block with the
Right.
the BRE, duct tape to it. And so you have these anecdotal things which can sometimes too often switch your strategy. And then on the other hand, I know for myself, I've even found myself trying to defend a strategy and defend off anecdotal evidence. And I think it's frustrating that we're not better at serving, and that we're not better at building that zero party data, because it does fill in this gap that I think is unique to the nonprofit space. When you're talking about relationships with brands, it's different than a relationship with nonprofits. Like there is a human connection between a donor and the cause that they're giving to, that's different than where you shop for groceries or the type of car that you're going to purchase, those sorts of consumer intent elements. And so, man, I'm totally tracking with you that the need to build that zero party data, the need to better listen is now. In your 15 months at Charity Water, what have you observed in terms of how they have been, or what have you done in terms of trying to spark this in and handle this challenge now?
Yeah, I think one of the things in Charity Water's success was just like an unbelievable intuitive sense. Scott in particular, uncanny sense of what will work and resonate or not, and it is a little gut instinct. Like a lot of founders who build a lot of visionary products, it's not always founded on data, otherwise they wouldn't do it. So there's been an element of that. And same thing with our creative team, just a real in tuneness. I think what's interesting though is as this core team has gotten older, right? People are starting to have families and not living in New York, and our audience isn't as maybe homogenous as it used to be. That strategy gets harder and harder to do, or it only works with a segment of people. So what you intuitively know or understand, great, it can still resonate with a huge chunk of people, but there's a lot of people that don't fit in that bucket. And even thinking about things like, TikTok or next channels, I have no idea. I have no idea. It's not my world. So that's where being more focused on some data and research is really important. And so I think we've kind of felt the pain to a degree of saying we still know this core and our core is amazing, but your core can only be so big. At some point, you have to start learning how to communicate and market to other types of groups in probably slightly different ways. And this is the challenge that most organizations and brands suffer from. I think we were really lucky when we kind of looked at our audience and indexed them. We basically indexed very similarly to America in terms of age profiles, interest profiles. We're pretty linked to just general America, which means we can probably do more of just the same old, and just reach more of America, and it will still work. Not a lot of organizations index that way. Not a lot of people have an accessible cause like clean water that most people can understand and get behind. We're not faith-based. We're politically agnostic. So we're pretty approachable in a lot of ways. So I think we've been able to put that off a little bit more than a lot of organizations who maybe tap out that core sooner. But we're still feeling some of that. So the need to develop some new, audiences based off some of our qualitative research and our quantitative research is really, really, really key. And I think we're just getting better too at developing our culture of experimentation and testing. So even if it is anecdotal, doesn't mean that we can't try something. Just the margin of error off anecdotal evidence is massive. And then you get narrower when it's qualitative, and narrower when it's a pool of qualitative, and narrower when it's quantitative, and narrower when it's a pool of quantitative. And there's a pyramid of trustworthiness. And I don't think that we should say, unless it's the top of the pyramid, we can't do anything, because then you lose a lot of really good ideas. It's just understanding the risks and the margin of error of what's informing your idea that's really, really critical. So, someone says, hey, I saw this from an organization. Great. We got nothing else in our testing queue. Let's run an experiment. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But that's a very different way to approach our growth strategy over the next 2 years. It's not, oh, someone has an idea. Let's do it. So depending on how important it is, and the margin of error is really critical to keep in mind too.
I love that. I love that one of the things that you had shared with us previously when we had chatted was just the golly, it's the maturation of Charity Water to now be investing more into direct marketing And so, obviously the success over time around the brand and the growth and the awareness and all of those things, which has been transformative. It's been, I think it's safe to say that it's a new model, but you hit a certain point to where you got to start to build a foundation around direct marketing and grow that. Can you talk a little bit about your approach in helping shape that direct marketing strategy, and how this testing mindset comes into building that out?
Yeah, I think a lot of things that led to our success were really organic, right? People fundraising on our behalf. We had a lot of kind of notable support early on. Our founder's very charismatic and has a strong following. Like, a lot of those things were great, but they're also tough to replicate. And the big shift to developing the Spring, our monthly giving program in 2016, was just that, Scott has a quote saying, starting from zero is untenable. And it was like, man, the calendar would flip over and the team would be like, oh my gosh, we have to do this all over again and hope people fundraise and hope that we do this. And was like, we cannot scale and grow if we're in this position. And so that's where the monthly giving program in particular was invested in hard, aggressively, and a huge focus, and then developing more of the traditional major gifts, mid-level gifts, those types of things. So at least on our side, so me and my team responsible for the consumer audience, so people who give $1,000 or less, essentially. And the Spring or monthly giving is the biggest focus of what we do. And we have about 70,000 members and about $22 million in annual recurring revenue. So it's a fairly sizable program as it is. And what you see with larger programs or with volume is you don't grow at the same rate. You can't just like, oh, 100% growth year-over-year. Like, it tails off. And even to the point where you can even shrink or flatline when your growth strategy, which was ours, primarily paid social, paid digital media heavy, once you start running into the issues that we ran into, it really curbs your growth. So, little background and context. So what we're trying to do now is say, not only what can get us back on a growth trajectory, but one of the things I love about Scott and this organization is saying we are trying to end the water crisis. We're not just trying to grow 5% year over year, that kind of thing. It's not this incremental approach. It's trying to say, how can we 3x this program in a few years? How can we 5x as an organization in a few, like, and that shifts the type of thinking, as opposed to like, oh, we got to do whatever we can to just make sure we hit our targets this year, which is a tough struggle, but say, what do we need to do today so we have the chance to 2x, 3x, 4x our program 3, 4, 5 years from now? And that type of mindset is really rare in our space. I've been doing a lot of learning from like venture capital, and it's unfortunate that we don't have those types of markets to tap into that basically say, we'll give you a big old pot of money and we'll give you 3 years and you got to meet some milestones, but we don't care about performance until year 3. And as much as we can, we're trying to adopt more of that mindset. And so, we can prove an idea like newsletter sponsorship, for example. We've done that a few times. It seems to perform well. The challenge is 40 monthly donors here, 40 monthly donors there. We need a bunch of those for us to actually grow the program, and to source them, execute them. The admin just goes up and up and up and up, and we can't sustain it. So it's highly efficient, very little scale. So it's kind of this narrow target of trading off efficiency and scale, and it depends for every organization where you're at. And so for us, we need some very highly scalable strategies, which moves us into things like TV, because there is unlimited scale to a degree, but trade off on efficiency. So we're standing up all these little pilots where we're making these little bets to see, is this an opportunity? Is this an opportunity? Like gentle pushes on the door to say, will this door open if we push harder? And then at some point you go, we can't make 12 little bets. We got to make a couple really big bets and commit to them over a series of time. Because where we are at in the growth stage, again, we're trying to 2x, 3x a program in a few years, not just, grow 5%. So very different mindset, very different stage, but I think that mindset should be more applicable to more nonprofits, or I wish it was.
Yeah. I mean, you see a lot right now, whether or not it was in your previous time at a couple different agencies, that, a lot of the mindset is about incremental growth annually, not 3x in 3 to 5 years, and not an end goal of end game of put ourselves out of business because we've solved the water crisis. And so
Right,
I
right.
I love I love that aspirational impact, and I got to think that that plays into the culture that you referenced earlier with respect to care for the donors, because you're asking for them to be invested in the cause. So as you think about these bets, these small bets and these big bets, how is Connect for me listening and surveying or understanding or building affinity data, Connect for me that part into the bets that you're making?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a difference of the acquisition and the retention side. And so, even going back to the first question around what does marketing and growth mean, we were intentional. I was intentional in the discovery or hiring process, and we've been intentional about making it marketing and growth. And growth is the difference is growth roles have more responsibilities across the whole life cycle of a donor or full funnel, whereas a lot of marketing traditionally is like top of funnel or one part of it, and then you kind of hand it off to another team. It's like, now it's your job to keep them and grow them. And I think that's very problematic. And so we said, if we're going to build a monthly giving program, we should use more growth models that, subscription, high volume subscription products have. And we want as a team to be responsible for the acquisition, the retention, the monetization, full cycle. So how that relates on the acquisition side, the listening is somewhat important because you can piece in some attribution data. So people maybe say, oh, I heard about you on TV, but they show up from a paid ad, so it helps fill some of that gap of saying, wow, a ton of people say they heard Scott speak or saw us on TV, and it never shows up in our attribution models or the end, last click kind of thing. So that's kind of important. And then you can model a little bit off that. I think where the listening becomes more important is on the messaging and positioning of the offer that you go out with, right? If we know that most people connect with the vision to end the water crisis or the impact on women and girls or those types of things, then that can shape maybe how we position ourselves when we go out to new audiences, if we know that's what resonates most to our core audience. But honestly, a lot of it is kind of like, now that you're in the community, what can we do to best serve you? Do you want to hear less? Do you want to hear more? What type of content do you want? Those types of things. So I think that's where a little bit more of the value lies, and those two are different sides of the same coin. If you acquire a bunch of people and then they all churn out, what's the point? You just wasted a bunch of money.
Yeah,
So I think, it's not like, oh, this is acquisition information, this is retention information. Those two things are linked inextricably.
yeah.
So it plays a role in each, but it probably leans a little bit more on the retention side.
Ronnie, I know you had a thought there. I could see it jumping forward, but just I have to jump in and say that, it's interesting when you think about large organization, as you mentioned, but then you take that same place and you put it down to a small organization. Maybe it's a local food bank, and one of the challenges that they found themselves in the last couple of years is just by the nature of what we've all walked through, they have acquired a ton of new donors,
Mm-hmm.
and already short-staffed pre-pandemic, and now they're wearing so many hats in a time of increased program need that it's hard for them to even set aside the time to figure out the strategies to say, hey, how can we get you, new donor to us, more involved in the organization? So that's where you are seeing some organizations really struggle with that retention, is because they've had to pick and choose where to apply their own resources, including their own time. And sometimes that just results in spilling off of donors that you just acquired, which is highly unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, there's some donors that they just purchased. They're not
Yeah,
committed.
for
They
sure.
don't, right? Local food bank you need, boom. You provide water, saw your ad, boom.
Yeah,
That's it. Like, we can't fool ourselves that like everyone wants this deep relationship. And
yeah,
like, I think sometimes we overdo it almost, of like, we got to know all the donors. And there's a ton of donors who just like, oh, I heard about you, I want to do good, you had me in the moment, I gave, and they will never give to you again. There's a huge chunk of retention that is impossible to retain.
yeah,
And so going back to like retention models or high commitment, low commitment, or your research, what we need to do a better job modeling is saying, this person we absolutely can and should retain, or this person will retain if we do nothing, or this person is at risk of never coming back again. and then changing the mix or the strategy based off those things as soon as we can,
Yeah.
and not saying like everyone is everyone's the same kind of thing.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's a part of the formative idea behind it is it was, Ronnie and I and a couple of other team members sitting around saying like, what this whole retention crisis, what do you make of that? And
yeah.
actually, to your point, what do donors think? Because they don't think they're in a retention crisis.
Right.
It's that, a cause comes in and out of their life, maybe, or maybe it's come into their life and it's staying. It's important to them. It's super interesting.
Yeah.
Ronnie, I knew you were gonna jump in with something.
Yeah, I mean, I was curious about the same kind of thing you asked. Is like this scale of, there's a limited amount of resources at a nonprofit organization, and how do you choose what to focus on? Which, Brady, you described it very well. So another thing that I'm kind of thinking about is, which you've described about Charity Water, in, as an organization grows, it's kind of like, a ship. As you're the small little craft in the water, you can turn and maneuver very quickly, and then you become this big cruise ship, and all of a sudden you can't make these big changes with limited resources, and having to apply those resources as a larger organization in a way that, can't hurt you. How do you go about taking these risks and trying these new things in a way that doesn't really hurt you and, impact your revenue?
Yeah, I mean that's what we're going through. So I can only share what we're what we're trying to do. It takes a while for it to kind of bear fruit. But I know I think one of the things is to just not buy into the narrative that because you're big and have scale that you are now a big cumbersome ship. There's some realities, but I think you can fight against it and how you structure your team. So for us, for example, we've structured a cross-functional team across our creative team and our product team to fit under marketing and growth, where there's a few direct people on the team and then a lot of people from other teams, and we try to operate on a sprint cycle. And it's a bit of a work in progress, but instead of saying, oh, here's what we're going to do 3 months from now or 6 months from now, we kind of have a roadmap high level, but it's really, what are we going to do in the next 2 weeks? What's the most important thing? We bring it into the queue, we try to execute all of it, and then we kind of, what's going on in the next 2 weeks. And so that's a way to kind of combat getting too caught up in, end of years, 4 months from now. It's great, but also what can we do today and not get too hung up on the big thing that's coming on the horizon. And I think the bigger you get, you have the temptation, and it's like, okay, Giving Tuesday, end of year, and you start walking it back, and now you're planning for end of year a year in advance because you have to, and print timelines and whatever. And what gets lost in the middle is all the other stuff that you should be doing in the meantime. So I think how we do work, the cultural side of things, there's a concept at Charity Work called safe to try that was in existence long before I ever got there. And it's just saying, look, if you want to take a risk, let's do some quick analysis and do the risk trade-off. And if the risk is low, and great, people will kind of give you thumbs up, say, I think it's safe to try. And so keeping those things in the culture, and I know Scott is trying to imbue within all of us his sense of risk taking. And it's one thing for your founder to take a bunch of risk. It's another thing to be kind of a cog in the wheel saying, can I also take risk? But when you look at really innovative organizations or high experimentation organizations, that cultural side of things get pushed all the way down. So people all feel this sense of, I can do things, I have autonomy, I can run experiments, we're not afraid to fail. And so it's again, it goes back to this real cultural thing, because without it, it ends up being the only person who can take a risk is the person at the top, and then the whole thing slows down. People feel like they can't ideate, oh, we won't be able to do it anyways, all those squelching things. And honestly, that's why I left the nonprofit space at first. I was leading marketing at an organization I loved, and it was just like I could not do anything that I thought was cool or innovative. And I probably could. I mean, I was relatively young, but I felt like nothing I wanted to do was ever going to see the light of day. And that's what crushes people more than salary and comp, and is like, I can't do cool work that I care about, that my skill set can do. And I feel like that's so sad. Like maybe we can't compete on comp and those things, but we should absolutely be able to compete on autonomy and risk and freedom and those kind of things. But we often are the opposite of that.
and the impact, right? And obviously, there's a lot of folks that end up here, here being the nonprofit marketing space, whether or not you're on the nonprofit side or on the agency side, because they want to see impact and they're leaning into their purpose. And I love the idea of empowering people to lean into that purpose in a way that really makes a difference. That's cool stuff, man. So okay, so just in terms of landing the plane, what I think is so interesting is the relational aspect of what we heard in our Listen Up study, which again is available at rkdgroup.com/listen up. That relational aspect of trying to better understand, what makes for a strong or a weak relationship. How do weak relationship donors versus strong, how do they relate back to the nonprofit? Something that you said there, Brady, I really gravitate towards, and that's your reference of the use of a sprint cycle. And when you're thinking about building relationships, you're probably in some ways thinking about like a high level roadmap of 6 to 12 months, but more
Right.
often than not, it's like, hey, what can I do today? Right? Or this week, I need to check in on this person, or what. So there is something that's about the culture of how we apply performance marketing, direct marketing, and not getting lost up in those high level, long-term decisions versus thinking in the now and being nimble and being open to data right now to make decisions. And man, that is hard for us in a control-based, long lead time industry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's way hard. But honestly, that's one of the things that I was interested in. When you consult, it's hard to get in there, like get in the guts, and that's where so much of the opportunity lies. On the culture side and what, like you can say things all day long as a consultant, and you can only get in there so much. But being internally, it's kind of like, well, it's no one's responsibility other than mine for some of these things, and it's not necessarily tactical. It's more, on the cultural side, which I think is really really interesting. Courtney Gaines from Next After did a good talk at the Nonprofit Innovation Optimization Summit last week. And a lot of it was just that human element of like checking in on people. There's a hurricane going on in Florida. Who are your donors that might be in that zip code area? And just send a note, be like, hey, we're just thinking about you. It's like those little touch points that maybe seem cheesy and donors will say, oh, I don't want that. But then you do it and it's really powerful for some folks. It's combining some of that with also some of the strategy of saying we basically have 30 days for the most part to win over a new donor. Generally speaking, like that's essentially it. You have the acquisition is normally the biggest indicator of whether someone will stay, is how you acquire them more than anything.
Yep.
And then you have a very, very narrow window to ship them. And once that window is closed, there's actually, yes, there's things you can do, but reality, there's not a ton you can do of significance outside of maybe your year end and a seasonal campaign,
Right.
And so blending these two things, which is say we should always care about donors, even if we're like the likelihood of them giving now is so small, doesn't mean you don't care about them.
Yeah.
While also knowing the statistics in the data of saying we got to win this battle real quick. It's blending those two things that's most critical.
So interesting. Good stuff, man. We appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I'm really certain by now that Ronnie has found a team. He can't choose Tottenham, can't choose Liverpool, but I think just by the end of this conversation, that he's probably lined up. And by the way, we both agree that you can't choose Chelsea, Man City, Man United, or Arsenal. Like you got to go outside of that group.
I was going to disappoint you all by choosing Manchester United. I figured that was probably the worst choice, right?
No, it's fine. No,
it's like the Yankees,
right?
I mean, sure. If you want to go to hell, you can. Sorry, I don't know if you can say that on this podcast. I don't know where it is. I'm just joking. Manchester United.
No, I mean that's you were referencing the Red Devils. It's the Red Devils.
Correct. There you go.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah. I mean, like honestly, right now it would be you could choose Wrexham, and if you watch the
great series, by the way, I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So, Brady, if someone wants to dig in, with you further, talk about either some of the tests that y'all are running, understand how you're using a sprint cycle internally, figure out why you have such a beef with Man United or why you have such an affinity for Liverpool. Where can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Personally, I have Twitter and LinkedIn probably. It's just at Brady Josephson or / Brady Josephson. And then honestly, I know a lot of people do this, but check out charitywater.org, sign up for email. I mean, if you want to make a monthly donation, I'm not opposed to it. But just check out the infrastructure. Don't necessarily just copy things blindly because some of the stuff isn't working. But, you know, check it out because I do think it's always good, you know, to see what other organizations are doing. And we got a lot of room to improve, but by and large, I think we do a lot of things, you know, pretty right. So if you want to see it for yourself, I think that's always a great way to do some personal research.
Right on. Appreciate that, man. Thanks so much for spending time with us today. And for the listening audience, the viewing audience, just a reminder that the full research study is available on rkdgroup.com. You can check out all the other episodes of the podcast and see other content that we put out. So appreciate it. Thanks so much for checking out this episode. We'll see you down the road.